everyone, my name is Katie Janky and I produced the video that you're about to watch. I'm 22 years old and Marion is my grandfather. I'm studying multimedia design at Hastings College, and Grandpa and I thought that doing a family history video would be a great portfolio piece for me. We started this project almost a year ago. I sat down with Grandpa and he told me everything that he knew about the Larson family history, and I took notes and began to organize the information. Then we started gathering old photos and videos or anything else that we might need. And a huge shout out goes to my mom, Deb Janky, and my Aunt Sue Rybicki for helping me with this phase. Then we set up a formal interview with Grandpa at his house in Grand Island and asked him the questions that I had prepped. Then came the post-production process, which is by far the most time-consuming. I turned 3 hours of interview footage into about 50 minutes by taking out the ums and the ahs, and I rearranged the clips to make the story flow. Next, I put in the photos and videos, built a family tree graphic, color corrected, and then collaborated with my mom and grandpa to make sure that all of the information is right. Altogether, I put over 100 hours into this project, but it was all worth it because I think it's really interesting to know where you come from. And even more, I think it's really important to document the family history for future generations. So, with all of that being said, I hope that you not only enjoy what I have put together, but I hope you learn a little bit about the Larson ancestry as well. Enjoy!
When I find new family history, I always get overly involved with it because I really want to know more. Our ancestors came, as far as I know, by steamer. There was no airplanes then, so it would have had to have been steamer. And then they landed at Ellis Island in New York, and from New York, people spread throughout the United States, different settlements. And that's why we shouldn't complain too much about the immigrants today that are coming legally, because we are made up of a nation of immigrants. We all got that background. In Denmark, each generation was named differently, their last name. So Grandpa Ole was born a Christensen, and his father's name was Lars Christensen. So they take Lars and then son, and then that's their last name, Larson. Or if it would have continued on, my dad's name would have been Olson, Ole son. And prior to the name Christensen in the family, the generation before that was Jorgensen. But they quit it 100 years ago. Lars was married twice. His first wife died. That's why Chris Larson and Ole Larson, my grandfather, are half-brothers, because Chris Larson was from the first wife of Lars Christensen. And Augusta was a full sister to Grandpa Ole. The reason Chris Larson, as far as I know, immigrated to the United States is for opportunity. He must have had a real imagination for all that he'd done in 50 years. He must have had a tremendous imagination. These are approximate dates, but they're close. He came to the United States about 1870. And then in 1898, he sent back and brought my grandfather, Ole, to the United States. Chris Larson had an implement store. He settled in Central City, Nebraska. And then he helped organize the Kronberg Danish Lutheran Church. This was 1899. Tornado come through and destroyed the church, and so they built a new church. Chris sold the land to the congregation at Kronberg to build a church. And Chris donated the first bell to the church, which is hanging in the churchyard now. And then also he donated some fencing for the cemetery. From there, they moved to California to Solvang, which was a Danish settlement, and he sold the Larson farm that he homesteaded. And he was in San Francisco when he was 25 years old, because he's on the census. And I got to thinking that I wonder if he came around through the canal or how he ever got to San Francisco instead of coming in to New York, Ellis Island. Maybe he came in through the Great Lakes and then somehow got off over in San, I don't know. But that part is puzzling to me. His son, Harold, which was the only beneficiary of his, lived in Hollywood. I think that both him and his dad were just entrepreneurs or whatever, because all the pictures I ever seen of him, and that's very few, he always wore a white shirt. Him and his son Harold went to Canada, to Standard, Alberta, Canada, and homesteaded all of this land. And they broke it up with plow and horses. He brought another nephew called Axel Larson to the United States. Axel Larson was a nephew of Christian Larson and Ole Larson, my grandfather. Then Axel lived with Grandpa Ole for a few years. And then Christian Larson again said, okay, I've got land in Solvang, California, and land in Standard, Alberta, Canada. Where do you want to go? And so he went to Standard, Alberta, Canada. And his sons and grandsons still have the farm, and it's a big wheat farm and a lot of cattle. And then Christian moved down to Racine, Wisconsin, and had a coal and lumber business on Lake Michigan. He died and was buried in Racine, Wisconsin, and I think he died when he was 57 years old. He would have been a very interesting man to know. Those dates, the late 1800s, he was a true entrepreneur. Coming from Denmark to the United States, he was only 25 years old, and started these businesses. And every place he went, he bought land. He just was a real goer for the early 19th century. I had never seen a picture of Chris Larson. And I was in the museum in Aurora a few years ago, and they had a Marquette section. And there was a picture of the baseball team at Kronberg, and Chris Larson was in it. She made a picture copy for me. Ole Larson was my grandfather, my dad's father. One reason Grandpa immigrated to the United States was Chris, his brother, wanted him to have a better life. And Denmark was under Germany's control at that time. And it was mandatory military training. And of course, Grandpa didn't want to do that. Ole came to the United States when he was 19, when Chris brought him over. And then Chris put him in college in Iowa. It was a Danish college, which is now called Dana College. And then after he got out of college, he went to work on Chris's farm at Marquette. He got married when he was 30 years old to my grandmother, Meta. And they had 5 children, 4 boys and 1 girl. Grandma Meta, she came from Princeton, Illinois. The family came from Princeton, Illinois in the late 1800s. And they came by covered wagon and team horses and a cow. And Grandpa Ole built a new house on the farm in 1906, I believe it was. And it's still standing in great shape. He was ahead of his time at that time. He was 40 years ahead of everybody else. Indoor bathroom was unheard of in those days. But his bathroom was probably 10 by 12, all mosaic tile. He had water pressure in the house. Had a 500-gallon supply tank in the basement. Had what you call a dumbwaiter to put fruit on, take it down in the basement and roll it up. He was a very innovative man. He was quite an artist too. And unfortunately, nobody's got any of his art. I remember as a child going out to the field where he was working, and he always worked with mules. And the equipment he had was a one-bottom hand plow with a team of mules, and he plowed 80 acres, walking behind those mules in that one plow. He wouldn't let my dad or Elmer come on his farm with tractors because he didn't want the soil packed. I had a pony called Spot, and once I could make him go, then I rode down my pony quite often and would have lunch with Grandma. Ole sold the farm to my Uncle Elmer, and then him and Grandma moved into Marquette, the town of Marquette. They rented a house that my mom and dad bought. That's the house that my parents had purchased to move on to our farm at a later time. And then Ole and Meta bought another house in Marquette, and that house stands yet today. And that's where they lived until they died. Grandpa Ole died when I was 20 years old. I was in the Air Force in Korea when he passed away. He died when he was 83 years old. And his wife, Meta, of course, Grandma Larson, she passed away when she was 86 years old. Larson was another brother of Grandpa Ole. And he moved to the United States and started farming at Kronberg. And Christian Larson was sending him money all the time to keep farm going. And finally the family just decided they wanted to move back to Denmark. And when we went to Denmark in 1979, we met with that family. The son was still alive. His name was Johan Larson. When we got to Petersburg, Denmark is where Grandpa come from. It was about 4 in the afternoon. Well, we were so excited to go try to find the Larson farm. So we found it. It was a long driveway. And we pulled down the driveway, and there this guy was bent over working in the garden. Well, he raised up and seen us, so we felt obligated to go on down. He stared at us, and we rolled down the window and tried to introduce ourselves. And Eileene, sister-in-law Eileene, could speak some Danish. So she finally got Johan, young Johan, and he was about 65 then, to understand that we were related, and Ole was our grandfather. So he invited us in. Loretta, my wife, had taken a scrapbook along. So we laid the scrapbook out on the dining room table, and then Johan went and got his scrapbook. And we kept turning pages. And there was a picture of Grandpa Ole in Johan's photo album. And then he got so excited he jumped up and left, and we didn't know where he went. He went outside, and he come back, and it had a whole armful of beer, cold beer. And he so then knew, we were related. And so we had to sit there and scold with him for a couple hours. And then him and his common-law wife, she was a nice lady, she invited us back for dinner the next day and fixed us, about a 4-course meal. But Johan said he remembered being in the United States. He's about 5 years old when they moved back to Denmark. You could tell that we were related with the Larsons because the Larsons are all short people over there, and I'm short. But the other Larson side, see, my grandmother, Meta, her name was Larson too. And all of those Larsons are tall. And then went to Grandpa Ole's church that he was baptized in. When we went to the church, of course we approached the preacher, told him who we were, and he spoke good English. His name was Nelson Christensen, and told him why we were there and who we'd looking up history on. I told him that Grandpa Larson was born March 28th, 1868. And he said, well, I don't think our records go back that far because after they're so old, they take them to the archives in Copenhagen. But he said, I'll look. So in the parsonage there was a cabinet, and he pulled out this old ledger and got flipping through the pages. And there it was, Ole Larson, son of Lars Christensen, farmer, and mother Kirsten Sorensen Christensen. It just was one heck of a feeling. So Gibbs and us left the preacher with $100, I think it was, and he was going to get some small vases for the altar, and they were in memory of Grandpa Ole Larson. And I've got a letter from the preacher then, later on, that acknowledged that he had gotten the vases and that they were on the altar. The preacher, he got a ladder and let us crawl up and open the trap door to the attic, and that whole church was put together with pegs. Wasn't a nail in it. The date up above was like 14 something. And then in reading about that church, which I got on Google, there used to be a castle built there prior to the church. Denmark is just gorgeous. It was quite an experience. Earl Larson was my dad's brother, and his wife's name was Virginia. He had two daughters, Jana and Jill. He graduated from Marquette High School, started farming in 1932. Earl rented a farm. It must have been terrible back then. You've heard him talk of the Dust Bowl. And he dried out. All he could raise is tomatoes around the windmill. He left here. Grandpa gave him $100 and said, you've got to go someplace else and get a job. So he went to Laramie, Wyoming, and got on at the railroad. Then World War II started, and he went to work for Boeing Aircraft Company. Then when he moved to California, he worked for Northrop King Aircraft Company, I believe it was. And then that's where he retired. And Earl passed away when he was about 86 years old, I think. Elmer Larson was always a farmer, and his wife's name was Ethel. He retired off the farm and sold the farm in 1962 and moved to Grand Island. I had a house built for him in Grand Island on South Arthur Street. And then he worked out at the ordnance plant for a period of time. Then he went to work for Loretta and I at the real estate company, putting up signs and taking down signs. Well, Elmer and I were close because they just lived across the street from us. We had just a relationship, him working at the office. And my dad died in 1966. And Elmer was just sort of like a grandpa to our family. He was a great guy. Of all the Larsons, he had the more even temper. Helen Larson was Dad's sister. She married Don Moist. They lived in Grand Island and Columbus, Nebraska for a long time. And he was connected with a moving company. They moved to Denver, Colorado, got a divorce when they was probably 45, and then Helen moved out to Washington, where Donald and Earl were. Helen had 2 children, Connie and Marvin. Helen died several years ago, and both Connie and Marvin are also dead. She'd always lived away. You know, yeah, you had a distant relationship, but back in those days, if you lived 50 miles from relation, you very seldom ever seen them. And you very seldom ever talked to them. The only line of communication was letters. And so if you called them on the telephone, you paid a long distance call. And it was just not feasible. So I remember Donald and Earl and Helen would maybe come back here to Nebraska maybe once every 5 years. That was it. My dad, Gilbert, he farmed. He had a thrash machine, done custom thrashing, done custom combine work, and he was just busy all the time. In 1932, when they come in with the farm program, he was a community committeeman, and that grew into a farmer fieldman job. And he was with that for probably 20 years. About 1946, my dad worked in Aurora at the FSA office, which used to be known as the AAA office. And he worked in there for several years. Dad was a serious guy. He was very fair and very honest. When he told you black was black, you knew it was black and not gray. He was short-tempered, very neat. Like when he would use a spade, he made sure that spade was shining when he was done with it. And when you used it, when I used it, I better make sure it was shining too. Because if he had to push a rusty spade, if you've ever done it, into the ground, it's a mess. But he was just a particular individual. Dad had his farm up to the time he died, and he had it rented out. He passed away in 1966, and he was 65 years old. Then when the lease was up, we had to sell it. None of us could buy it because a trip around the world cost a dime, nobody get out of sight. And it sold for $60,000, 200 acres. A shame. Today there's a pivot on it. The farm's located a mile north and 3/4 west of Marquette. That was the farm that all our family was born at. What we did on the farm was naturally had row crops, corn, soybeans, milo, and we had hogs, cattle in the feedlot, always about 50 head. And then we had the dairy. And my old dairy barn is still standing. They've let it deteriorate, but it's still standing. The door in the loft in the barn, that door is off of the old house of my parents' farm when they moved the other house on the farm. Gets confusing, but that door was given to me by a friend that took it off the house when they was tearing the house down and restored it. And so I've had it all these years. My favorite memory, one of my favorite memories, was running up and down the hills and the pastures, the canyons, playing cops and robbers, playing Indian and cowboy. This wintertime, sledding down the long hills. My mother's name was Kate. She was a small lady, and her personality was jolly. People that knew her yet today, what they remember about her is her laugh. She laughed at anything. My mother was so particular that she would sweep the dirt from the house to the outside toilet. She would actually sweep the dirt. Just can't do nothing but say good things about her. My mother died when she was 48 years old. I was 17 when she died. Dad remarried in 1957, and he married Esther Ediger. Don Larson was my dad's brother, younger brother. He had a pleasant personality, but he had a temper also. And he always wore a white shirt and necktie his whole life. He was married several times. He left high school right in the height of the Depression, and there was no jobs. And they had what they called CCC camps. They were like a military camp. But what they did was they did domestic work. These tree groves you see planted around the country, they were planted by the CCC. He was there for a couple of years, I think. And then he moved to Columbus. And I think that he ran a service station. I'm not for sure, but I think a service station. And from there he moved to Seattle, Washington, and worked in the Boeing aircraft plant. And Don had a pilot's license. And he had a Cessna 172, I believe it was, a four-place. And him and his stepson flew from Seattle to Marquette, just the two of them. And he never told Grandma and Grandpa about this, or my dad, or Elmer. But the plane went down in Montana. And I don't really remember why it went down. But anyway, he got it where he could, had control of it and lit it on a highway. They come out and fixed it, whatever was wrong with it, and they took off again. Then later on, he was in Spokane, Washington, working for a printing company. And then he had a printing company of his own. Then he moved to San Francisco and worked for Wells Fargo. Then when he moved to Chico, California, he was probably 50 years old. And he bought a case tractor and a backhoe and a truck. And he started digging foundations for houses and for water lines. And he'd done that probably for 5-6 years. Don didn't have a lot of possessions, but for his desk, how they have your name and what have you, I've got a desk nameplate. Well, this was interesting. So I had lost contact with Jana probably 20 years ago when her dad died. And hell, I didn't know where to get a hold of her. So Deb got on Google, and there were several Jana Larsons in California. But there was this one that said Montrose, California, formerly Van Nuys, California. Well, that's where my Uncle Earl lived, Van Nuys. So I said, I'll bet that's her. So the next day, during the day, I called that number. No answer. But I left a message, who I was and who I was calling for. And if I was so lucky that she was the Jana Larson I was looking for, give me a call. And the next day she called and she said, Marion, where have you been? So we had a good conversation for probably 2 hours. So she said, no, we can't let this happen and lose track of each other anymore. But she's 62 years old and never been married. She's a court reporter, or was a court reporter, and still works in the judge's office, I think. Main thing that we talked about and visited about, the family reunion that we had in Estes Park, Colorado, Then we had a family reunion down in Scottsdale, too, that she was at. And she was hoping I was calling about another family reunion. I said, no, those are days that are over for me. But anyway, we really didn't talk about anything special, just that type of thing. The family reunion in Estes Park was put together by Twyla, Gibb's daughter, the people from Canada, the sons of this Axel Larson. They were there. Donald, Earl Larson, Gibb's family. We stayed at a lodge, the whole group stayed at the lodge. Betty was my only sister. Betty was 7 years older than I. She became a teacher out of high school. When my mother died, Betty really just sort of filled in for her. She'd do my dad's and my washing and clean house. She just was a sweetheart. Her smile, her friendliness, and in all those years, I never remember Betty and I having a harsh word between each other, not once. She married Bob Ortegren, and they farmed. During tough farming years, they had to quit. And Bob went to work for the First National Bank at Marquette and was there for several years, and then moved to Omaha, worked for the PCA, and then he moved back to North Platte, him and Betty. And that's where their kids graduated, all except Kathy. She graduated in Texas. And Bob passed away when he was 58 years old from heart bypass. And she was widowed for probably 40 years. The medical profession broke them because they canceled Bob's insurance. They had to sell their home, so they just had a tough life financially. Betty just passed away last year, and she was 89 years old. I miss her very much. Called her probably 3-4 times a week, every week. She is a sweet lady. And Brother Gibb was about 9 years older than I. And Gibb was, overall, he was a great guy. Gibb and I farmed next door to each other. Gibb and Gilbert bought a farm right next to where Dad's farm was. He lived there probably 20 years before he quit. He fed cattle and farmed, and cattle took him down, broke him, so he had to quit. He quit a year before I did and moved to North Platte and went to work for McDonald's Jam McDonald Company, which was a dry goods store. Then he got into the real estate business like I was, and he sold out to his partner several years ago. Gibb was talented with his hands. He could do wood carvings. I had a rifle that I bought years ago. And while I was in Korea, he done wood carvings on it. Fantastic. And he passed away, I think it's 4 years ago. Eileene, his wife, is still living. She lives in a home in Lincoln, Nebraska. And Eileene is probably 92 years old. Eileen's personality was very quiet. She's very smart. She was valedictorian in her class. She just, nice lady. What's my story? I was born August 5th of 1932, and the day I was born, they said it was 100 degrees. I was born breech, and I weighed 8 pounds. My poor mother, I think about that so often. It must have been hell. I was born at Marquette Farm, which was out by Grandpa Larson Ole's farm. The house is no longer there. We moved off of that farm when I was 8 years old. And Dad and Mom bought the farm out west of Marquette. They bought that in 1939. Paid $18 an acre for it. But it took him and my mother 20 years to save $2,000 to make a down payment on the farm. And I went to Marquette grade school in Marquette my first 3 years, and then we moved on the west side of Marquette, and I went to School District 89, which was a mile from our house. I was the only one in my grade, and in this country school, I think the total amount of children was probably 15. And I went through the 8th grade there. Betty was my 8th grade teacher. And then I became a freshman at Marquette and graduated in 1950. Well, the baseball field used to be at Marquette High School. It laid across from the elevator, and then between the elevator and the schoolhouse. And as I drive by there, I try to think about that ball field. And it's pretty much gone now. Down they got a football field east of the school. But there's no school there anymore. I had a neighbor called Don Anderson. We called him Humphrey. And he was a good friend up to the day he died. The cousins I grew up with in the neighborhood was Don and Kenneth Danauer. And but otherwise, that's about the only cousins. The rest of them were older than I. The first time that I seen Loretta was at a movie theater. And she was with her little brother Roger and Mary. And I can still see her. The movie was over. They turned the lights up. And she got up in front of about 5 rows. And she had a red dress on. And man, she just took my eye that fast. Loretta, when I first seen her, was probably 14. Casually, we just got to know each other later on, 2, 3 years later. I was like 19, 20, and I didn't want to get married then. But she did. Then I went off to the service in December 27th, 1950. I went to the United States Air Force. Then I went to Korea February 17th, 1952. And was there until February 17th, 1953. Well, I never had it tough in the war. I was in supply, which was airplane maintenance. And so we were behind the front line. The closest I ever got to them was probably 30 miles. So I always felt fairly safe. War is hell, and it's got to be hell when you're on the front lines, because many a caskets I helped carry off of airplanes. And you live rough. Your living conditions aren't too good. We had it good, we figured, because we built living quarters. 4 of us built living quarters up in a hangar in the corner, and we stood up boxes to create this room. And then we lined it with what they call pickling paper, which is like oilcloth, which they wrapped motors and stuff in. And then we had our own stove, and that was right above the supply room. But we had one plane, a biplane the old style, open cockpit. We always called him Bed Check Charlie. But he was from North Korea. And he would fly below the radar. And he would drop hand grenades. Never did get him. Well, Dad wrote me about every week. I'd write him a letter about once a week. Loretta, I darn near got a letter from her every day. And I wrote her, of course. Oh my God, it meant a lot because, you know, when you went over there then, you didn't talk to nobody. But now you pick up your cell phone and I guess you can call Iraq. And the soldiers visit with their families. And I don't know if I'd really like that or not. Make me awful homesick. You know, just be talking to your family and then grab your gun and go hunting. Then I come home and talk to Loretta into marrying me. We got married March 22nd, 1953. Then and lived at Hayward, California, right by San Francisco. And then in October, I'd already been to Korea. Korean War was over with. They had too many people in the service, so they offered an early out. So I got out at the end of 3 years. And we come back to Marquette, moved on my dad's place, and farmed for 7 or 8 years. Loretta and I had a dairy that milked as many as 90 cows. The bank would not loan us any more money except for 1 year. Went home and told Loretta, now's our chance, run. So moved to Grand Island. We lived in Pioneer Boulevard, and then 1733, South Arthur, then Gun Barrel Road. We built that house in Gun Barrel Road too. We lived there 11 years. A lot of good memories. We lived right by the lake. Scared to death one of the kids are going to drown. Always hollering at them to put on their life jackets. We had a pontoon boat. We had fun there.
He's coming. Hey. Oh, dear.
Are you gonna let them out there?
No. Kitty. Say something, Shan. Poor Shan, he can't figure out what's going on. He can't keep going. He's gonna bite it. Look at the table. Oh, you talk. Talk to him. Call it, shut up.
We had about 6 thoroughbred mares that we got out of Kentucky. And then the other animals was Boots, our dog, and then Debbie and Susan were in 4-H, and they each had a Palomino horse. Oh, and Loretta had Harlequin Great Dane. Natalie was the dog's name. And the dogs were so inbred that she just was sick all the time. And she finally gave her to another lady that took care of her. Well, the last bunch of cats that we had, kittens, they turned out to be wild then. Deb stopped, you know, she got older, and she didn't pay as much attention to them. And so Loretta and Deb caught them all one day and gave them to a guy over in Phillips, Nebraska, I think. And when they let them out, I think that they went every which way. Trips, that's one thing we did a lot of, because I always liked to travel, and Loretta liked to travel. And we wanted our offspring to enjoy the different things in life around the whole country. You know, what the culture was like in Washington and in California and New York. The only problem was, and we took them to all those places, they were too young when we did it. And they don't have a lot of memory. Now, Steve and Mike did, but Susan and Deborah don't have a lot of memory of it. but we did a lot of traveling. Got in the insurance business, which is terrible, because you never see anything that you really accomplish. So then I got my real estate license in 1962. The real estate business, I just love it, because you're creating something. I was the first salesman that Daily Realty in Grand Island ever had, so I helped start that company. And in Grand Island, we developed a lot of land: Capitol Heights, Lee Heights, Hidden Lakes, Ravenwood. Just enjoyed it. I was there for 7 years. Then Loretta and I started our own company, Larson Realty. But the first year that Loretta and I went on our own, we listed 160 houses. Loretta was a great telephone person to get appointments. She would make appointments and I'd go on them. And I remember one party one time said, "Well, Mrs. Larson, I am getting tired of you calling all the time. So get down here and get it listed and let's sell it." So it was rewarding. And the whole family flourished by it because, back then we was able to buy the boys little Honda motor scooters and pretty curls for the girls and bicycles. Then had the opportunity to join an organization called Gateway Realty. Then we got Hastings, Kearney, and Grand Island Gateway Realties. After a few years, we sold Hastings and Kearney and kept the one in Grand Island. Then in 1977, we sold the office in Grand Island and moved to Scottsdale, Arizona. We had a real estate office about a year after we moved there. And it was just timing was wrong. Interest rates went up as high as 20%. Just didn't sell anything. You just didn't know what was going to happen. We'd saved $70,000. So Loretta and I decided, okay, here's $70,000. Budget it. And when that $70,000 is gone, our wheels better be turning. If they weren't, we were out. So that was the big gamble then. So we quit and come back to the farm and build a new house. Loretta drew the floor plan. I told her to draw it however she wanted it. She always planned a house around what the next buyer might want to buy, But I said, this one just however you want it. We finished it in November of '86, shut it up, went back to Arizona, come back in the spring. We had a little dam. That didn't hold a lot of water, but it held some, and we'd keep it full. And we raised fish in it. So when the grandkids would come down there, they would fish and always catch something. To bring you further up to date, Loretta passed away November 1st, 1997, which is 18 years ago today. It's been hell ever since. But we made it, we're still making it. Loretta was a dear person. She was very kind, very supportive. She didn't like the business field that much, but she was always there to help with it when I needed it. She was a mother at heart. Her children were, the light of her eye. You can see old pictures where she had them all dressed up, just always dressed perfect. Was a great mother, much more so than I was a great father. But she understood, that we'd been down the tube and I had to work nights and what have you. She was very supportive in anything that I ever done. She was just a great wife. Let me say, they don't make them like her no more. They broke the mold when they made her. Then this year, I bought a townhouse in Grand Island remodeled it, and that's right up to today. We had a great life, just a great life.
Larson family video. Take one.
Germany has been a bully ever since I remember. I shouldn't have said that, maybe. Well, didn't I just get done?
But the battery died.
Katie bent down and her pants ripped.
Stop eating cheeseburgers, apparently. I could not believe it.
Another blooper.
Another blooper, yeah. Alright, we ready? Now everybody has to be quiet.
I got that. Okay, that's
Then I had a brain fart. Yeah. Jill is married. Her name is, or his name is Chuck Viagra. Another blooper.